In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the English settlements and some of the reasons that the English decided to come to the Americas. Some of them were very similar to the Spanish. They saw the riches that the Spanish were gaining from the New World. England saw Spain catching up and gaining power in Europe because of their colonies. The English wanted in on that. Their justification for colonizing the Americas is we want riches from the New World. We want to civilize the Native Americans. And they use something called the Black Legend as justification for coming and quote-unquote saving the Native Americans. And the Black Legend was this idea that Spain was being especially brutal to the Native Americans and that the Native Americans needed to be colonized in a nicer way, and that England would be the one to do that. That England would come and quote-unquote civilize the Native Americans in a civilized way instead of torturing them and massacring them like the Spanish would, and everybody would get along and be happy and everything would be fine. That's not what would end up happening, but it was an English justification. We're going there to save the Native Americans. They also considered the Spanish as their natural enemies. The Spanish were Catholic and the English were Protestant, and there's a lot of animosity between those two religions that play out in this competition to colonize the Americas. Why did some people come? Some people came because England was overcrowded. Some people came for religious reasons, and some people came to find gold. And we have three main areas that the English would settle. We have the northern colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. Right now I'm going to be talking about the northern colonies, which would be the Massachusetts Bay and New England colonies. Each of these three distinct areas drew different people from England to their shores. So they came for different reasons, and those different reasons are going to inform how these three separate regions developed differently from one another. The climate plays a big factor in that as well, but they're also the motives of the people coming to the northern colonies as opposed to coming to the southern colonies is going to impact how those colonies develop. In the northern colonies, we first see the Puritans arrive on the shores of the United States. They are not the first English people to settle in the Americas, but it is the focus of our lecture today. So who were the Puritans? The Puritans, in our popular imagination, these are the Pilgrims, and we're going to talk more about what their life looked like. Here's a quick map of what these northern colonies would have looked like. And to really understand these Puritans who would settle in America, we need to understand the Protestant Reformation. Before the Protestant Reformation, all of Europe was united behind the Catholic Church. So it doesn't matter what part of Europe you're from, if you're enemies, if you're friends, if you're France, if you're England, Spain, all of these nations were united under the Catholic Pope, the Catholic Church. So the Pope had a lot of power in Europe, and Catholic priests had a lot of power in Europe. You needed a priest to interpret the Bible for you. People didn't read the Bibles themselves. You needed priests to baptize you. You needed them for your marriage, for your catechism, for Mass, for your last rites. Every stage of your life needed a priest administering sacraments for you and interpreting the Bible for you. That is until a German monk named Martin Luther in 1517 would come and say, hey, I have some problems with how the Catholic Church is operating. And he was Catholic himself, so he wasn't trying to tear the church apart, but he was trying to reform it. He saw some issues with it. One of those is an issue of the selling of indulgences. An indulgence would be a piece of paper or document that would sell salvation to you or your ancestors. So you can go buy an indulgence for your deceased grandfather, and basically by purchasing this indulgence, you are buying your grandfather's way into heaven. And Martin Luther said, this isn't in the Bible. This is a corruption. This is not how our relationship with God is supposed to be. And what he really saw happening was German money from German peasants was going to Rome, to enrich the Vatican, the Catholic headquarters, the Pope. They were building St. Peter's Basilica. They were raising a lot of money for that. And Luther said, you're just tricking German people into thinking they're buying salvation and taking their money for your building projects. And that's not okay. That's not right. He also had a disagreement with the Catholic Church on this issue of justification. Justification is this idea that when you're standing in front of God, are you going to be justified in front of him? Are you going to be cleansed and free of sin? Is he going to see you as a pure person that he can allow into heaven? To achieve this justification, though, the Catholic Church believed you had to do good works. That good works did play a part in your salvation. You could, in some ways, earn your salvation by doing good things and by fulfilling sacraments, by being baptized, by going to Mass, by having your last rites performed before you die. All of these things were helping you attain salvation, attain heaven and unity with God. Martin Luther said, no, that's not in fact the case. You only get salvation by grace of God, by the grace of Jesus Christ. That there's nothing that humans can do to earn heaven and to earn a relationship with God. We are all sinful and evil, and it's only through Jesus' grace that we are able to reach heaven and have a relationship with him. So that was a big difference between Luther and Catholics, who believed that your good deeds actually could earn you salvation, and sacraments could earn you salvation. So Luther, as a German monk, would start to ask questions in the Catholic Church about indulgences, about justification. He would start to advocate for dialogue, like, we need to talk about this isn't really correct, or can we have a discussion about this? And the Catholic Church did not respond well to his questioning. They would eventually warn him and then excommunicate him, kick him out of the church for good. Once they kicked Martin Luther out of the church for good, this created a fracture in the church as a whole, because a lot of people listened to Luther and followed him and agreed with his ideas. So the ones who would follow Luther after this split were called the Protestants, because they protested against the Catholic Church. And many leaders in Europe would decide to follow Luther instead of the Catholic Church. So then a lot of local princes, kings, and leaders in Europe had to decide, am I going to follow Luther and become Protestant, or am I going to remain loyal to the Catholic Church? And whatever that ruler decided, his entire population, those who swore fealty to him, would have to follow his religion. So if one particular prince decided to become a Protestant, everybody living within his realm would have to become Protestant. So this really fractures Europe into two competing Christian denominations that did not like each other. There was a lot of violence. So that brings us to the Anglican Church. This is the English Church. Originally, England would remain Catholic. They were loyal to the Catholic Church, but Henry VIII needed a divorce from his wife to produce a male heir, and the Pope was not going to let him get a divorce. So Henry VIII, who was a very devout Catholic, ended up leaving the Catholic Church and becoming Protestant, and creating the Church of England. And now all of England had to follow the Anglican Church and could not be Catholic. And the Catholic churches were plundered, their wealth was taken, there was a lot of violence in this transformation, and then the Anglican Church became the Supreme Church of England. However, the Anglican Church still remained pretty Catholic. It had a lot of rituals, it had a lot of the same garments, and it had the same look as Catholicism. And that is because Henry VIII really was happy to be Catholic until he wanted his divorce. So the church that they ended up creating looked very similar to Catholic Church. It's just that now the Pope is not in charge, so that Henry VIII can get his divorce. So the Puritans were Protestants in England who didn't believe the Reformation went far enough. They said, okay, we're Protestant now, we have the Anglican Church, but it's still way too Catholic, and Catholics are our enemies. They consider Catholics to be an evil, so we can't just have all of these Catholic looks and ceremonies and feel. We can't have all these rituals in our church. We can't have these big fancy stained glass windows and fancy garments in our church. We need to get rid of all of that and start over. We need to really purify the church. And here are some images of the Church of England and Anglican Church, and as you can tell, the look is still very Catholic. The stained glass windows, the garments that the priests wear, the bishops would wear, they still had a hierarchy, so you still had bishops and archbishops and priests in a very similar hierarchy as you would have in the Catholic Church. So Puritans were the ones who wanted to purify the Church of England and take out all of these remnants of Catholicism. They did not want the church to look Catholic at all. But one thing that the Anglicans and the Puritans had in common was a hate for everything Catholic. They were very anti-Catholic. They believed that Catholics were a tyrannical people because they were taught to be subservient to a hierarchy. So they had their Pope who told them what to do, and that taught them to be obedient to your king and to your prince and to not think for yourself. You needed a priest to read the Bible to you. You needed a priest to tell you what to do, whereas in the Protestant faith, individual people could read the Bible for themselves, and you didn't have the strict hierarchy. You didn't have a pope and archbishops and cardinals and all of that. Protestants believed that they were a uniquely free people compared to Catholics, and they saw Catholics as the enemies of freedom. So both Anglicans and Puritans in England would see Catholics as their enemies, but Puritans were the ones who believed that really the English church didn't go far enough. It still looked too Catholic. So a lot of the Puritans would eventually leave England and come to America specifically to create a Puritan society that would be free from the sin and the corruption of the Anglicans around them. And that's why they came to America. It wasn't for religious freedom in the sense that they were not willing to give religious freedom to others outside of the Puritan faith. It was to only create a Puritan society. The Puritans who came to the Americas were heavily influenced by a French Protestant leader called John Calvin. And John Calvin believed that all humans were sinners and thus deserved God's wrath and punishment, deserved hell. But out of God's mercy and grace, he chose a very select group of people before they were even born to be saved, to be set apart. These were the people going to heaven, and these people were called the elect. So that they were chosen by God. There was nothing they could do to earn that. So if you're not chosen, you're going to hell, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're not part of the elect. He believed that Christ died only for the sins of the elect, so that if you were not part of the elect, he did not die for you. You are not part of his plan for salvation. Humans cannot resist God's word, so that if you were part of the elect and God chose you, you cannot resist that. And if you were not, you were left in condemnation. You were left as a sinner who is destined for hell. And he believed that the elect will continue to sin, but will be purified throughout their lives by Christ, and they will ultimately be saved by Christ. So how do Puritans know if they actually are elect? This is the tricky part. There's no way to actually determine for sure if you were actually chosen by God to be elect and to be destined for heaven, or if you were left in condemnation, if you were left in God's wrath and destined for hell. So this created kind of a paranoid environment for Puritans where they didn't know for sure what their ultimate salvation was. They couldn't just do good works or even ask Jesus to be their savior to attain heaven. There was nothing they could do. It had to be just God's decision whether he chose them or not to be elect. So this created a lot of paranoia among Puritans, as you can imagine, not knowing your ultimate destination, not knowing if you were condemned to hell or saved for heaven. So one thing that they tried to do was live lives as if they were elect. And they said this must be proof. If we are just living good lives, if we are living as if we were elect, that must be evidence itself that we are elect. So they would try to do good works in every aspect of their lives, and if they were successful, that must be because God chose them to be elect. If they lived very purely and did not sin often, this must be evidence that God chose them to be elect. Or the opposite, if they were living very sinful lives, this is probably evidence that you're not elect, because how could an elect person possibly be doing the things that you're doing? And there's one story I heard, I still need to find the source about this to verify it, but it really shows how anxious Puritans were, so I'm going to share it with you. There was a Puritan woman who was reported to have thrown her baby into a well to drown her, and in doing so, she was trying to test whether she was in fact elect or not. And her reasoning was, if I am actually physically capable of throwing my child into a well to drown her, then I must not be elect. And now all this uncertainty in my head about whether or not I'm saved is gone. Because if I'm able to drown her, then I'm not elect and I'm destined for hell. But at least I know now. I have that certainty. I'm not kind of racked with this paranoia and uncertainty. Whereas if I'm not physically able to drown my baby, that's proof that I actually am elect and destined for heaven. Again, I need to find the source for this story, but I think it really sheds light on the level of paranoia. And Puritans they did try things like this to figure out if they were elect or not, and I will be talking more about that. So if you are living in such a society and you see somebody living very sinfully next to you, you start to kind of be paranoid that those people are going to rub off on you or drag your society down. You are trying so hard to live a pure life, to show evidence that you are in fact saved by God, that you are elect. So if somebody in your society is not living a pure life, if they are living sinfully, how would you react to that? You see them as a threat to your salvation and your society's salvation. So these Puritans who had moved to the Americas created a very strict society where there was no tolerance for people who thought outside of the box, for people who were living sinfully, or for people who had their own ideas about religion. You had to be very strictly following the Puritan religion, or else the threat was you were going to drag the rest of society down. Who were these pilgrims, these Puritans who would come to North America? They would leave England because they thought that by living with Anglicans, by living in an unpure society that was not fully reformed, they were still too Catholic, they were still too sinful, that society was going to drag their people down. So their people would be influenced by sin, they'd be surrounded by sin, and that would ultimately lead them to sin and then demonstrate the qualities of somebody who is not elect. So they said, we need to just remove ourselves from this situation altogether and create a society by ourselves in this new land where we can practice our religion only and not be influenced by anybody else. They really wanted to hold on to their holiness because that was their proof that they were elect. So they would eventually leave England and land in Plymouth, an area that was largely uninhabited because the Native Americans who had lived there were decimated by diseases brought by Europeans. And their thought was that they would create such a pure, holy society in this new land that England would look at them and want to be like them and look at them as an example. To the north of Plymouth, this area would eventually be settled by the Massachusetts Bay Company. And the Massachusetts Bay Company was a joint stock company, meaning a lot of different wealthier individuals in England put their money together to create this company. And that whatever success and riches that company would have, that success and riches would ultimately go to those individuals who bought stock in the company. So they all had ownership of this company. They were all Puritan, and their goal was to go to Massachusetts, establish a society, and bring success and wealth and riches to the Puritan society, but also to set up a society in which Puritans can practice their religion without corruption, just like the Pilgrims in Plymouth. The Massachusetts Bay Company was given a charter by the English crown to create this society and to colonize America, and a charter was basically a document that formed the company and defined its privileges, what it was able to do and what it was not able to do. One of the leaders of this Massachusetts Bay Colony was a man called John Winthrop. He was a lawyer who would eventually become the governor of Massachusetts. He's very famous for his city on a hill speech. As they were sailing to settle in Massachusetts, he gave a speech to define how the Puritans were supposed to live with one another once they arrived. And he laid the groundwork for a community in which everybody looked after one another, that everybody shared brotherly affection with one another, everybody got along, the rich would take care of the poor, everybody would share to make sure that people were taken care of. And he claimed that this new society would basically be kind of like the new Israel, God's chosen people, that God would make a covenant, a promise with this new Puritan society, and that he would protect them as long as they lived holy. But if they didn't live holy, God would punish them. And Winthrop claimed that his new Puritan society would be like a city on a hill, meaning the rest of the world would look at his society as an example, as a shining light for everybody else to emulate. This phrase, the city on a hill, would be quoted by a lot of American presidents moving forward to describe what they believed America was for the rest of the world. So now we're going to look at what this Puritan society looked like in New England. Most of the people would come over as complete family units, and this is different than how the Spanish came and even how the English in the southern colonies would come. The Puritans came as families because they were trying to recreate their community in the Americas. So they brought their wives, they brought their children, and they were pretty well off. They were middle class, they had their own money to pay for their voyage and set up this new society. Even though they were, for the most part, well off, they were not allowed to be showy. It went against the Puritan religion and culture to show off their wealth and to dress extravagantly. So they would dress in very black colors, very modestly. The thought was that it was a sin to show off your wealth, and that you really wanted to look as frugal and modest as possible and use your wealth to give back to the community. You didn't want to just enrich yourself and show off your own status and wealth. You wanted to give that money back to the community because that's what God ultimately wanted. Jewelry was sinful, so if you think about the pilgrims and how they're often depicted wearing all black and then the black hats, this is why. It went back to their religion. Their cities were set up in towns, and in that town, the church would be the very center of their community. And most of these churches were congregational, which meant all of the members voted to elect ministers. It was more democratic than a lot of other churches. This also extended to their government. Their governments were democratic, in which the people would be able to vote and make decisions together. However, to become a voting member of society, you had to become a member of your local church. To become a member of the local church, you had to be considered part of the elect. So really only the elect could vote in Puritan societies. To prove that you were elect, you would often have to be interviewed by people, and you would have to express your conversion story. So that meant, how did you originally become a Christian? So you had to tell the story of how you knew you must be one of the elect, and you had to give that conversion story to the elders, and they would allow you to become a voting member of society. It was the primary role of the government to make sure that people in Puritan societies were living pure lives without any sin. And again, we're living in a society of kind of fear and paranoia that if we tolerate any type of sin or thinking outside the box or living differently, it's going to be a demonstration that we are not part of the elect. And if our neighbor's doing it, it's going to influence and corrupt us to start living sinfully and taking away our assurance of being part of God's elect. The government was really concerned with making sure Puritans were living pure lives. And that ties into this idea of moral liberty, that the people had freedom only to do good. That was called moral liberty. They were not allowed to sin. They were not allowed to do things that were considered sinful, even if it wasn't hurting the people around them. If it was considered sinful, you simply weren't allowed to do it. And that if you were not doing good, you would be cast out of society. So you had to go to church on Sundays. You had to remain moral, or you were at risk of being banished. The Protestants, particularly the Puritans, were also very hard workers. They were very industrious, and this term is called the Protestant work ethic. And part of the reasoning behind that is the fact that the Protestants felt that success in their work was a sign of salvation. That everything they had to do, everything they put their hands to, that they were doing it for God. They had to do it at their utmost best. They couldn't just take shortcuts. They couldn't skip over something. They couldn't put half their heart into it. They had to perform their work as if they were elect. And if they were very successful in their work, it was a sign that God approved of them and what they were doing. If God granted you success, it was likely a sign that you were in fact part of the elect. And if God did not grant you success, that was possibly proof that you were not part of the elect and God did not bless your work. So the society they created was really one of a biblical commonwealth where the entire society was dictated by the Bible. The culture was centered around the church, and that anybody who strayed outside of this was cast out. Here's a view of a Protestant Puritan town in New England. You can see that the church is in the center of society. One particular Puritan was very much against this idea of a biblical commonwealth in which the church was tied to the state. This man was named Roger Williams. He believed that the church and the state should be separated. The Puritans viewed him as a threat and banished him from Massachusetts. Roger Williams would go on to create his own society in Rhode Island, where he would welcome and accept different denominations and different forms of Christianity. He created a much more inclusive place in Rhode Island. Another person who would challenge the Puritan elite was a woman named Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson started holding Bible studies within her own house. And that was problematic because, first of all, she was a woman and she was teaching both women and men, which was not allowed. And second of all, she was teaching based on her own authority. So it was not orthodox Puritan teaching. She was claiming to get direct revelations from God, that God was speaking directly to her. And this really challenged the Puritan elite, who saw her as a threat, first of all, to their power, but also to their status as an elect holy people, because now she's bringing in some new message and claiming it's directly from God, and it might counter their own messages and their own understanding of God. And then she was eventually arrested and put on trial, where she would claim that she was being spoken to by God, and she spoke out against the local ministers, and she was ultimately banished from society and sent to the frontier, where she was eventually killed by Native Americans. In 1692, we have the very famous Salem witch trials, in which some women started having dreams that they blamed on witches, and eventually a slave woman would be arrested and put on trial for being a witch, and then accusations really got out of control from there. So one way to really prove that you are not in fact yourself a witch is to blame somebody else for being a witch and putting a spell on you or cursing you. And then these accusations would spiral out of control, where everybody's blaming each other of being witches, usually unmarried women, usually women on the frontiers of society who didn't conform neatly to Puritan society. If you weren't married, if you were single, if you were standing out, if you were a little bit weird, and this was all very dangerous. And many women were actually executed for being accused of witches. In terms of relationship with Native Americans, the Puritans originally told themselves that they were coming over to civilize and Christianize the Native Americans and to in some ways help them as they saw it. This would not end up happening. When the Puritans got to North America, they pretty much stayed away from the Native Americans. They were fearful of the freedom that Native Americans had and the lifestyle that they had. And they were fearful that their people would be enticed by this freedom, their life in nature, and that the Puritans would leave the strict confines of their society to live with the Native Americans. So Puritans really insulated themselves from life with the Native Americans, or from interacting with them in many ways at all. But you could see in the state seal of Massachusetts, there is a Native American saying, "Come over and help us," pretty much. This was the idea that the Native Americans were in need of help, of civilization, and that they wanted to learn English ways of life, and it was the Puritans' job to teach them. This was in fact not the case. But as the Puritan population starts to expand, they start to come into conflicts with Native Americans, and the Native Americans start to fear that their way of life was under threat with this rapid expansion of this Puritan society. In one case, the Pequot tribe would kill a fur trader, and then the Puritans would eventually wipe out the entire Pequot tribe in retaliation. In another instance where the New Englanders went to war with the indigenous Native American tribes is King Philip's War. That started when Native Americans attacked English farms for expanding into native lands. They wanted to strike first. The English would retaliate, and the Native Americans united around a man called King Metacom, or as the English called him, King Philip. Both sides committed brutal massacres against one another, but the English wrote the history and propagated this image of the Native Americans as brutal savages, though both sides fought very brutally in this war. Eventually, the English would kill King Philip and put his head on a spike outside of Plymouth, where it stayed for 2 decades. These wars would further decimate Native American populations and pave the way for the English to move even further inland. Generations removed from those first Puritans who settled in America, their descendants would become very prosperous with trade, merchants, fishing, shipbuilding, all of these different middle-class jobs that they had. Their population would boom, and they would become a bit removed from the early Puritan values of their forefathers. They would dress more lavishly, they would exhibit their wealth, and they wanted to start living like their counterparts in England. So their life became more similar to those who lived in England, rather than staying distinct and living as their forefathers had, as a very Puritan conservative culture. And this is more or less what New England looked like at the time of the American Revolution. The descendants of those early Puritans were living more like Englishmen back at home than as somebody living very apart and distinct from that.